Along the abbreviated coast of New Hampshire sits a small white chapel that looks out over the Atlantic Ocean. In the summer, seagulls cry out, circling above, waiting for the tide to go out to discover what has been left for them along the shore. White caps of waves crash endlessly into the beaches and brings with it a breeze that fills this little chapel with the smell of the ocean. It is a constant reminder. The one-room chapel looks as if it came directly from a Norman Rockwell painting, with a church picnic serving as the scene, a small boy ready to stick his finger in a pie, and a priest looks on as shepherd of the sweets and baked goods table. A white picket fence borders the chapel, serving as a defense from something, but what that is, no one knows, but it looks perfect. The steeple is tall, rising up to a point high above in the front of the building with a bell in its tower that hasn't been rung in, well, no one could really remember, but it looks even better than the fence. Inside the rows of 10 benches that are divided down the middle of the room by an aisle that has welcomed every person who has walked through the chapel doors over the nearly 200 years of its existence. An oak pulpit sits alone in the front of the room off to the left side, with an organ sitting on the right, which hasn't worked since 1986. The congregation didn't have the monies required to fix it then, but once an electric keyboard was donated to the church in 1990, the members had got so used to seeing the organ that they just left it. It looks wonderful. The members of this church to this day will tell you that the best music to ever come out of the chapel was during those 4 years of a cappella. It sounded amazing. The oak benches are hard, 200-year-old benches that you wonder if they were made uncomfortable on purpose, something to keep Mr. Franson awake. They had failed, indeed. Most Sunday mornings, Mrs. Franson would poke her husband in the side to awaken him from the nap that he had started 24 hours before in a leather recliner in their living room at home, and the same nap that he had only been interrupted by a long night of sleep. These benches told a story, the wear of thousands of cotton dresses, wool pants, and the dirty fingers of every little boy that has found his way to the well on the backside of the church property before service, and the pool of water that collected in the grass, and the frogs that lived there, and the mud that came with them back into the chapel on the bottoms of their shoes and on their fingers. The benches would be washed regularly, and over the years had been refinished a number of times, with some of the hardened polyurethane still dripping down on the bottoms of the seats, like icicles frozen in time. As you run your hand across the wooden seats, you can feel the long swooping grains indented in the wood, with each bench unique, and the members of the congregation over time would be able to sit on each bench blindfolded and know exactly which bench they were sitting on. The parishioners knew their church. Each Sunday, there were two truths. Service would begin at 9:30, and Lisa Larson would walk in the back door promptly at 9:40. Pulling with her the 5 little boys that made up her family, ages 12 to 2. Her husband chose not to attend. Everyone knew that if they pushed back the start time to 10 o'clock, Lisa would arrive promptly at 10:10. Pastor Thompson wanted to start later, but he knew that on at least 16 weeks of the year, he would lose part of his parish to the New England Patriots, and some of his members would stay home, preparing at home to worship something else. He was okay with that. So church started promptly at 9:30. 9:30 would arrive. Pastor Stevens would immediately begin his sermon, teaching something about kindness, loving others, or repenting of your sins. It was a small enough group that he knew what to say based on the struggles he saw in each of them. Lisa Larson would arrive at 9:40 with such regularity that no one in the congregation even turned around. She would take her place on the back row on the left, sitting herself on the outside of the row, in case her 2-year-old decided he wanted off her lap and needed to walk around. At 10:10 a.m., a particular thing would occur. Pastor Thompson would come to the end of the sentence and quietly say amen. The audience would echo their response and stand, stretching their legs. Then on cue, Lisa would pick up her 2-year-old son, gather her remaining 4 boys, and begin the short walk to the front of the chapel, passing Mr. and Mrs. Franson and the Edgerton family as they went to the back of the chapel. As they passed each other, they would smile with their mouths that led up to their eyes, greeting each other without saying a word. Lisa would sit on the front row, placing her 4 boys next to her, and then wait. Then the row behind her would walk to the back of the chapel, passing on their way those in the congregation that had been seated in row 9 of the benches, who would then take their seats behind Lisa in row number 2. This would occur until the full swap of the room was complete. It was on a summer's day in 1988 when a family on vacation from Phoenix, Arizona visited this little chapel. The Johnsons had flown into Boston to visit family and then decided to take a trip up the New England coast. And on this particular Sunday, the family saw a little white chapel that had set next to the Atlantic Ocean, and they decided to attend the service. Shortly after the service, after all of the regular parishioners had finished their greetings and well wishes, the Pastor Thompson extended his hand of welcome to the visiting family. "May we ask you a question?" Stephen Johnson, the father, asked. With a knowing smile, Pastor Thompson shook his head and said, "Why, yes." "Why did this meeting stop halfway through? Why did everyone stand and switch places in the chapel? What are the reasons for that?" Stephen asked. Pastor Thompson answered, "This little chapel was built in the year of our Lord 1814. Of course, in those days there wasn't any electricity to cool this room down in the heat of the summer or to warm it up during those bitter cold days of winter. There wasn't any insulation like we have today, so the congregation brought in a pot-bellied stove and placed it over there in the corner," he said, pointing to the far corner of the chapel. "Well, it seems that in those early years of the church, the heat created by that little stove could only heat up so much of the room. As you feel the breeze now," he said, pointing his hand out toward the ocean breeze, "imagine what that wind would feel like in the middle of the winter months, finding its way through every hole and crack and space in the wood of our little chapel." It was on one of those dastardly cold days of winter when a young widow had brought her 3 young boys to church. Their father and her husband had been killed while fighting in the South against the Confederates in the Civil War. She was often late to service, and on this particular Sunday, as she opened the door to come in the service, a large gust of wind swept off the Atlantic. The wind was so cold, as she sat down in the back of the chapel, all the while trying to get warmed up in the unevenly heated room from the winter's chill, a particular thing happened. Everyone in the congregation had turned around and noticed this young mother and children as they walked in and sat. A family, not much different from your family here, I would imagine, rose to their feet and offered to let this widow and family take their seats in the front of the chapel, much closer to the fire. The mother and her children graciously accepted, and others in the front also noticed that most of the members in the back were also bundled up trying to stay warm. They gave up their seats as well to others in the back. The tradition began that halfway through the service, everyone would stand, break, and take a look at those around them. A small reflection of life, if you will. They would give up what they had and look to those in need. Those in the back of the chapel would humble themselves, accepting the gifts of others, and walk forward to warm themselves for the rest of the service. It became such a part of the congregation, the tradition of giving up your seat for someone else, that they continued doing it year after year and all year round. Then as generation after generation passed through those doors, those acts, those small acts of kindness followed with them as they left through the doors back into their lives in the community. Neighbors took neighbors' meals when sick or torn by economic conditions, during times of war, at deaths, and during disabilities. Those who received were more willing to accept help from others. It created a culture in our church. It created a lifestyle in our community. Then in the 1930s, we finally got electricity. The old potbelly stove was replaced by an oil heater, but the tradition lives on even to this day. What did they do with the old stove? Kristen, the 10-year-old daughter of the Johnsons, asked. Well, they took it to a foundry and melted it down and made it into a bell. If you look up high in the steeple, he said, pointing up to the steeple that seemed to have served no purpose at all, the bell in the steeple rests there as a reminder. It is only rung twice a year, once to announce the first day of winter, and the second to call the community to Christmas Eve services. Pastor Thompson and the Johnsons continued talking about their trip and what they had planned, but in her mind, Kristen Johnson, a 10-year-old girl, contemplated all that had transpired that morning. She stood looking up at the steeple, not noticing that her family had drifted off into the parking lot in the direction of their car. "Kristen, we need to get going," her mother announced from the other side of the car. "Pastor Thompson, thank you so much for your hospitality today and for telling us that story. It was amazing," Kristen's father said while trying to get the family situated. "It was my pleasure. May the good Lord bless you during your travels here," the pastor announced in a blessing sort of way, with a smile on his face that started with his mouth and led to his eyes. "Kids, what did you think of church today?" Kristen's father asked as they pulled away from the church. "I want to get married there," Kristen said, looking out the window of the little white church with a small white picket fence and a steeple that holds a very important bell. "You what?" her mother asked. "I'm going to get married in that church," she repeated. Kristen pressed her face against the window, watching as the little white chapel disappeared into the distance, and all she could think about was how beautiful the music was. Chapter 2. She was as lovely as any woman he had ever seen. As she walked into the room, he noticed her immediately. She looked down at the floor, embarrassed by all the attention she seemed to be getting, but especially from him. Then bashfully she looked up from the old wooden floor, and their eyes met. It was love at first sight. Two people who knew in that moment that their lives would never be the same again. Eric's palms began to sweat. The thoughts about what he could or should say to her boggled his mind, and he wondered if he was able to say anything at all. His hands wrung together, trying anything to calm his nerves as she began walking towards him. His weight shifted from his left leg to his right, and then back to his left again, hearing the creaking of the old wood floor beneath his feet, sounding as if it was breathing, groaning. Eric looked down at his shoes, then realized he needed to breathe as well. A summer breeze carried through the room as she walked in, giving Eric a brief respite. The room seemed to come to an eerie silence as he looked back up at this woman from across the room. Everyone else stopped to turn their heads and rose as Kristen Johnson entered the room. She was as beautiful as any bride could have ever wanted to be, and Eric's eyes locked in on hers, communicating with her without saying a word. But she knew what he was saying. The short walk down the aisle that divided 10 rows of oak benches began with a single step. It had been Kristen's dream to get married in this chapel, almost the dream of a lifetime. The small white chapel on the coast of New Hampshire could only seat so many, so the task of deciding who could attend was made much easier by the distance of flying everyone from across the country. But those who knew Kristen also knew that there wasn't any other way to get married, at least not for her. She hadn't seen the chapel until they had arrived on Friday in preparation for the Saturday wedding. It looked exactly like she remembered it. Pastor Thompson, who was getting close to the age of to retire, was going about his usual task in the church one day when he received a call. It was a call from a small little girl whom he had met 19 years before, whom had now grown into a woman. It hadn't taken him long to remember the conversation he had with a family visiting from Arizona, and was delighted when asked if he and the chapel were available for a wedding ceremony. The audience stood up from the uncomfortable oak benches and watched as Kristen walked into the room with a shy, sheepish smile. She wore a simple white satin dress that mimicked the shape of her body, with a lace extension that draped to the floor. Her flowers were a simple collection of green orchids, with the stems wrapped together with a ribbon of white. Her hair was simple, no flowers to draw attention. She didn't need that. No curls or extensions. Her hair fell across her eyes, and she would reach up and collect the wayward strands and tuck them gently behind her left ear. Her long brown hair was just the way Eric remembered it when he first saw Kristen walking into an office that sat opposite of his. He fell in love with her at that moment. The nervousness quickly turned to excitement in Eric's heart as she got closer. Eric watched as his bride-to-be walked down the aisle alone. He couldn't be away from her another moment. Then, like a young child running to her father as he walked through the front door after a long day at work, Eric ran to her. He didn't care that it wasn't the normal thing to do at a wedding. He took her by the hand, placed it in the angle of his elbow, and finished walking her to the front of the little white chapel. He didn't care that the audience gasped and then laughed, because in the end they smiled and then they cried. No better way to approach the rest of their lives together, he thought, than to do it side by side, walking into their future. Once there, the attendees took their seats again in the old oak benches that were made uncomfortable on purpose, and no one seemed to care one bit. Chapter 3. The ceremony went on like most ceremonies you might have ever attended. Pastor Thompson gave his normal thoughtful remarks about meeting this young girl, now turned into this beautiful woman standing in front of him and the rest of the chapel. He spoke of meeting with them the night before and how impressed he was with the love and commitment that he showed towards each other. It was time for the vows, and Pastor Thompson asked Eric to begin. Kristen Johnson, I take you to be the love of my life. I take you to be my lawfully wedded wife. Kristen, I fell in love with you from the moment I first laid my eyes on you. I knew from that moment, when our eyes first met, that you were sharing part of my soul. I make a promise to you in front of our families and friends that from this day forward I will love and protect you unceasingly. This is all I ask of you. When I die, let me do it in your arms, peacefully, happily, and ever-loving, breathing in your last breath, then I will exhale mine. Let me know that you were with me always, and we were never apart. When I die, let me do it wearing my favorite Dodgers t-shirt, and you wearing your love pink sweats, with our arms and legs wrapped around each other as we watch our last movie together. When I die, I will know that I lived a lifetime of dreams and fantasies with you by my side. When I die, let me know that our lives are only beginning. But for now, let me live. Let me wake up each morning in your arms, peacefully, happily, and ever-loving, kissing you with the first breath of each day. While I live, I want to have every moment, every memory I own shared with you. While I live, help me experience a lifetime of dreams and fantasies with you next to me, hand in hand and arm in arm. Let us build a barrel list together and fill it over and over. While I live, I want every day together to start like it is our last together on this earth, never wasting a breath or a chance to kiss your lips. While I live, I will love you forever, starting today and then tomorrow. While I live, let our forevers engulf each day, waking up each morning to begin forever again. Then when forever is finished, I will know I have loved you enough. Kristen wept as she listened to Eric finish his public love letter to her. Tears streamed down her face, causing her sister Rebecca to leave the front row of benches and bring her a tissue. The ceremony finished with Pastor Thompson asking the couple to exchange rings. It seems that Eric had heard a story or two about this little white chapel on the abbreviated coast of New Hampshire. He had listened as Kristen told him the story of the uneven heated room and the congregation that stood and rose in the middle of service and then traded places to allow others to feel the warmth of the stove. Eric had remembered the story of the bell that was only rung twice a year, once as a remembrance of winter coming, and the other to call the congregation to Christmas Eve service. Eric had also made a call to Pastor Thompson in preparation for today's events. Pastor Thompson had climbed the stairs to the steeple and had found the leftover cast iron not needed for the bell. At Eric's wishes, he took the remnants to a local artist who was then asked to make 2 wedding bands from the iron that had once been a pot-bellied stove that had taught a congregation and then a community to give of themselves, but then to also humble themselves. Eric and Pastor Thompson couldn't think of a more appropriate use of the iron. Pastor Thompson told the story as the bride and groom placed their rings, sizes 6 and 10, on each other's fingers. They fit perfectly. Then they kissed and held each other's hands and walked down the aisle that had welcomed everyone in and had changed everyone once in before they left. As Krista and Eric exited the chapel into the bright sunlight of a June day in New England, they felt a breeze coming off the Atlantic Ocean, and it was another reminder. And then the bell in the tower began to ring, and Krista knew exactly why she always wanted to be married in this little white chapel along the abbreviated coast of New Hampshire.